One of history's greatest tragedies began as quietly as a dying man's last breath. No one would have thought that the day when the last Crusader soldier left the bloody ruins of Acre actually marked the end of a 200-year dream. But that is exactly what happened in that spring month when the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Kalil's army marched northward to finally erase the Christian presence from the Holy Land. The decline of the Crusader States did not happen overnight. After Saladin's victory at Hattin and the conquest of Jerusalem, the Christian presence in the Holy Land could never fully recover. Although Richard the Lionheart recaptured the coastal cities during the Third Crusade, the inland territories were lost forever. The Kingdom of Jerusalem thereafter represented only a narrow coastal strip, with its center becoming the port city of Acre. At the turn of the new century, the situation worsened further. Less and less support arrived from Europe. The crusading ideal, which had once ignited the entire continent, began to cool. Rulers were preoccupied with their own country's affairs, and the popes themselves often became embroiled in political struggles. The Holy Land slowly became isolated, like a forgotten island in a stormy sea. The territory of the Crusader States continuously shrank throughout the 13th century. The old, magnificent castles fell one by one. Belvoir, Safed, Beaufort. Each name represented another loss. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, who once formed the backbone of the Christian presence, were increasingly forced into a defensive position. But perhaps the greatest problem threatened the Crusader states from within. The colonists' sons, who were born and raised in the Holy Land, increasingly separated themselves from European Christians. These people were called Poulani, from the French word poulain, meaning colt. They already spoke Arabic, understood Eastern customs, and often understood each other better with their Muslim neighbors than with newly arrived European crusaders. Political division also became increasingly severe. Constant rivalry existed between the various cities, castles, and provinces. The counts and lords of Tripoli, Antioch, and Acre often intrigued against each other, instead of uniting against the common enemy. The military orders, Templars, Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Order were also rivals, and it happened that they competed with each other for the same castle or territory. Meanwhile, a new, fearsome power rose in Egypt, the Mamluk Empire. The Mamluks were originally slave soldiers whom Muslim rulers bought and trained. But as the danger of Mongol invasion threatened the Muslim world, these slaves gained increasing power. Eventually, they seized control over Egypt and Syria themselves. The real turning point came when Baybars became the Mamluk Sultan. This man, whom his contemporaries called the Panther for his cruelty and cunning, became one of the greatest enemies of the Crusader states. Baybars was not merely a military genius, but also a political one. He understood that the Crusader states could not be defeated in a single great battle. As Saladin had done at Hattin instead, they had to be taken apart methodically, castle by castle, city by city. Baybars's campaigns in the 60s and 70s of the 13th century wrought destruction unprecedented since Saladin's time. Caesarea, Arsuf, Safed, Jaffa, these legendary Crusader castles fell one by one, and Baybars was not as magnanimous as Saladin. When he captured a castle, he often massacred the entire garrison to make an example. One of the most horrific events was the fall of Safed Castle. This massive fortress, built by the Templars, was one of the cornerstones of Christian defense. When Baybars besieged it, the castle commander resisted for a long time, hoping that help would come from Acre. But help never came. Finally, tormented by hunger and thirst, the defenders surrendered after Baybars promised they could leave freely. But Baybars broke his promise. When the Templars and Crusader soldiers stepped out of the castle at the Mamluk Sultan's command, they were all beheaded. According to Arab chronicles, 2,000 Crusaders died that day, and their blood stained the ground so red that its trace was visible for weeks. This massacre had such a terrorizing effect on other Crusader castles that many immediately surrendered when the Mamluks appeared. However, Baybars did not only fight against the castles, he also revived the idea of jihad that Saladin had proclaimed. Volunteers from various parts of the Muslim world flocked to his army, who considered the fight against the Crusaders a holy war. This religious enthusiasm gave the Mamluk armies a strength that the exhausted and divided Crusader states could not match. After Baybars' death, the Mamluk leadership temporarily became divided, and this gave the Christians a brief respite. But this period did not last long. When Sultan Qalaun consolidated his power, the fate of the Crusader states became uncertain again. Qalaun was a brilliant strategist. He understood that the Crusaders did not necessarily need to be militarily annihilated. It was enough to cut them off from trade routes and supplies. Therefore, during his campaigns, he did not always attack the largest castles, but rather the smaller fortifications and cities that controlled the trade routes. By the end of the 80s of the 13th century, the Crusader states had practically shrunk to two cities, Acre and Tripoli. Tripoli was the old, proud county seat, while Acre became the new capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But both existed as isolated islands in the middle of a Muslim sea. The fall of Tripoli was heartbreaking. The city's defenders, who had seen what happened to other Crusader strongholds, knew they could not count on help. When Qalaun's army appeared below the walls, the Count of Tripoli made desperate attempts to save the city's inhabitants. But Qalaun was unwilling to negotiate. The siege of the city was brief and brutal. When the Mamluk soldiers finally broke through, a bloodbath began that contemporary Christian chroniclers could barely put into words. An eyewitness described it thus: "The sea was stained red with blood flowing from the city. The air was filled with the screams of the dying and the voices of those praying, seeking God's mercy in their final hours." After the fall of Tripoli, Acre remained the last significant Christian city in the Holy Land, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the final reckoning came. Acre at that time was the greatest commercial center of Christian East. Venetian, Genoese, Pisan, and Catalan ships lined up in the city's harbor. Italian merchants, French knights, German soldiers, and Arab interpreters bustled through its streets. Temples, palaces, warehouses, and bazaars lined the city walls. Acre was like a little Europe on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. But this wealth and diversity did not mean strength. On the contrary, constant disputes and quarrels raged among the city's inhabitants. Venetians and Genoese often fought open street battles with each other over commercial privileges. The military orders, Templars, Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Order, rivaled each other for influence. The king, if the weak ruler of that time could be called a king at all, could barely maintain order in his own capital. Most of the city's inhabitants were aware of the danger. They knew that after Tripoli's fall, Acre was next. Envoys traveled to Europe. Urgent letters were sent to the Pope, to rulers, to any influential person who might help. But Europe was far away, and the rulers there were preoccupied with other matters. If you enjoyed this story from the dramatic years of the Crusader States' decline, then subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Many more exciting videos await you about the Middle Ages' greatest battles and the epic events of the Crusades. Sultan Qalaun originally wanted to besiege Acre himself, but death intervened. His son, al-Ashraf Kalil, inherited the empire and his father's plans. The young sultan, who was barely 30 years old at the time, decided that he would be the one to finally end the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. The decisive step arose from an event that outraged the Mamluk court. A group of Italian mercenaries who arrived in Acre, drunk, attacked some Muslim merchants in the city. The incident led to a serious diplomatic crisis. Al-Ashraf's demand was simple: hand over the guilty parties or face the consequences. The Council of Acre, however, was divided. Some suggested fulfilling the Sultan's request for the sake of peace. Others insisted that Christian soldiers could not be handed over to the pagans. This debate dragged on for weeks until al-Ashraf finally tired of waiting. The Sultan convened a war council. According to Arab sources, every prominent emir was present at the meeting. The decision was unanimous. Acre must fall. Al-Ashraf immediately ordered mobilization. The Mamluk army that assembled around the Nile Delta was of impressive size. Estimates suggest that more than 60,000 to 80,000 soldiers set out from the Egyptian plains northward. Among them were heavy cavalry, light armored cavalry, thousands of foot soldiers, and what was perhaps most fearsome, a vast number of siege engines and cannons. The deployment of the Mamluk army took months. The enormous column slowly snaked through the Sinai Desert, then northward along the Palestinian coast. Contemporary Arab chronicles proudly described that the army was so long that when the first units were already camping before Acre, the last ones were still in Egypt. Meanwhile, feverish preparations were underway in Acre. The Grand Master of the Templars, Guillaume de Beaujeu, who was an experienced and wise leader, tried to organize the city's defense. The Hospitallers, the Teutonic Order, and other military organizations also mobilized all their forces. Venetian and Genoese merchants put their ships at the service of defense against the siege. But the numbers spoke mercilessly in favor of the Mamluks. In Acre, there were barely 10,000 fighters in total, including knights, mercenaries, and citizens. The number of women, children, and non-fighting men was about 30,000. Against this, the Mamluk army was several times larger. In the spring month, when al-Ashraf's army arrived at the walls of Acre, the city's defenders could finally see face to face what awaited them. The Mamluk camp was so huge that it almost covered the entire plain outside the city walls. At night, thousands of campfires illuminated the landscape like a starry sky on earth. Al-Ashraf was in no hurry. He knew that time was his ally. First, he surrounded the city from the land side to prevent any land-based supplies from arriving. Then he began to deploy his siege engines, massive catapults that hurled stone balls at the city walls, and siege towers from which archers could shoot at the defenders. The Mamluk siege engines were particularly fearsome. Arab engineers had studied and developed these machines for generations. Some catapults were so large that an entire team of oxen was needed to move them. The stone balls they fired weighed up to 300 pounds, and when they crashed into the city's buildings, they destroyed everything in their path. In the first days of the siege, it seemed that the defenders would be able to resist. The city walls were strong, and Guillaume de Beaujeu brilliantly organized the defense. He assigned knights and soldiers to each section, who guarded in shifts. The craftsmen in the city worked day and night to repair damage and create new defensive equipment. But as the days passed, the situation became increasingly hopeless. The Mamluk catapults ceaselessly hurled stones that gradually demolished the city walls. The besiegers' mining teams began to undermine the foundations of the walls to force them to collapse. The citizens, who initially trusted in salvation, became increasingly desperate. The Templars and Hospitallers fought heroically. They organized nighttime sorties into the Mamluk camp, trying to set fire to the siege engines and confuse the enemy. These sorties were sometimes successful, but always cost heavy casualties. Every knight who fell was an irreplaceable loss for the city. Guillaume de Beaujeu, the Templar Grand Master, exemplarily led his soldiers. Arab sources wrote of him with respect as an enemy difficult to defeat. A contemporary Muslim chronicler wrote, "The Christian commander was like a wounded lion who fights until the last moment. His courage was admirable, even if he was an infidel." But heroism was not enough. The Mamluk superiority was simply overwhelming. As the weeks passed, the city walls crumbled in more and more places. The defenders were exhausted, reserves were depleting, and panic began to spread among the citizens. Many tried to escape from the city by ship. Constant tumult reigned in the harbor as people jostled for places on the few available ships. Venetian and Genoese merchants sometimes took pity and transported people for free. Other times demanded exorbitant sums for a single place. Families were torn apart when men stayed to fight while women and children fled. At the beginning of the decisive assault, the Mamluks had finally caused enough damage to the walls to attempt a breakthrough. Al-Ashraf personally led his soldiers into battle. The sound of Arab drums and trumpets filled the air as tens of thousands of Muslim soldiers rushed toward the city walls. The defenders made their final effort. Guillaume de Beaujeu personally stood at the top of the ladders, sword in hand, and repelled the first wave. But an arrow struck him, penetrating his armor. Blood streamed from the wound, but the Grand Master did not leave his position. Only when he finally weakened completely did his companions carry him to a nearby house. Guillaume de Beaujeu's death was a tremendous loss for the defenders. The Templar Grand Master was not only their military leader, but also the spiritual support of the city. When news spread that he had died, something broke in many soldiers. Resistance became increasingly disorganized. The Mamluk soldiers finally broke into the city at its weakest point. As they poured into the streets, the defenders retreated to the inner fortifications. The entire city was ravaged by battle. Desperate fighting occurred at every street corner, in every house, in every square. The last Christian defenders retreated to the tower of the Templar house. This massive, solid building was the strongest point in the city. In the tower, several hundred knights, soldiers, and fleeing citizens crowded together. They knew there was no escape, but they fought on. The Mamluks besieged the tower for days. Finally, they so thoroughly undermined its foundation that the entire building collapsed. The ruins of the tower buried both defenders and besiegers beneath them. According to Arab sources, the collapse was so great that it could be heard from other parts of the city, and the dust could be seen from miles away. After the fall of Acre, the Mamluks methodically eliminated every Crusader fortress and city on the coast. Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, none could resist. Within a few months, the entire Crusader presence disappeared from the Holy Land. 200 years of Crusader history came to an end like the flame of an extinguished candle. The tragedy lay not only in the military defeat, but also in what it meant. Europe had committed its centuries, its blood, its treasure to realize a dream that the Holy Land would remain Christian. But this dream ultimately dissipated like morning fog. The catastrophe of Acre was particularly tragic because it could have been avoided. If the Crusader States had united, if Europe had supported them more seriously, if the diplomats had acted more wisely, perhaps everything would have turned out differently. But in history, there is no if. There is only what happened. After the Mamluk victory, al-Ashraf ordered that Acre's walls be completely demolished. He did not want any future crusade to attempt to return and rebuild the city. The ruins of Acre were gradually erased by the sea and wind, and after a few decades, almost nothing reminded anyone that the capital of Christian East had once stood here. The fall of the Crusader States had a profound impact on European society. The knightly ideal, which had crystallized around the Crusades, suffered a severe blow. The military orders, especially the Templars, soon became victims of persecution in Europe. Many believed that if God had allowed the loss of the Holy Land, perhaps he was punishing Christians for some sin. If you enjoyed this story about the final days of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land, then share it with your friends and comment on what was most shocking to you in this tragic story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos, in which we will continue discovering great historical adventures. See you in the next episode.